Lords of the Black Banner, a Mongolian epic. Fractured Empire, Book 2. Written by Starr Davies. Narrated by David Wiseman. Dedicated to Professor Kyle Fingerson for opening the door to this amazing discovery. Chapter 3. Springing Traps. Ming Ordos Territory, 1468. 5,000 mounted warriors waited on either slope overlooking the valley below, tucked back amid dawn redwood trees and gray boulders that lined the valley walls. The horses were stashed away and their muzzles wrapped to keep them silent as Bayon's men waited. He had organized a brilliant plan to discover who was stealing from the Mongols in his name. His men had loaded several carts full of food and felt, as well as 2 carts carrying materials to construct a gare. It was just enough to entice whoever was behind these raids. A small party of Bayon's best fighters were disguised as Mongol peasants in these humid lands, and they walked alongside carts pulled by yaks, their swords hid in the carts or under deals to avoid raising suspicion. Fewer than 100 of his men walked or rode mounts alongside the caravan. According to Ming Tao, one of the local Shakar commanders, this valley saw the most raids. Bayon had sent scouts through the area, and they confirmed that something had recently happened in the valley. Suspicious that this was a trap, Bayon insisted that Ming Tao and his men accompany him on the mission. He placed Ming Tao's men on the opposite side of the valley, where they were at more of a disadvantage to escape, should this be a trap to close Bayon and his men in, a stroke of Birkaday's genius during initial planning. His guard and best friend perpetually remained suspicious of anything that threatened Bayon's life. Now, Bayon stroked the nose of his chestnut mare, Ondear, to keep her calm as he surveyed the valley below. A scout rushed up to him from a narrow passage behind him. "They're coming from Zhizya," the scout confirmed. "It's a small party, maybe 100 at most. We can easily crush them." "I want some men taken alive," Bayon said. Excitement and fear pumped through his veins as he turned his gaze toward the caravan lumbering along the valley floor. "I want to know who they serve, and why they are spreading these lies." The scout nodded and turned his mount to carry out the prince's command along the lines. Bayon had already commanded Ming Tao to make sure they captured as many of the men as possible for questioning. Whether the commander would listen to him had yet to be determined. Bayon remained uncertain if he could trust the man. At a signal from Bayon, his men prepared bows and kept a careful eye on the valley. Sweat dripped down Bayon's neck, but he resisted the urge to swipe it away. This land was hot and humid. He longed to return to the cooler, dry air of the north. He smiled as he thought about the women there, as insects buzzed in the air, causing horses to flick their tails to swat them away. No one moved as they watched the valley where this force would appear to head off the caravan. Not for the first time, Bayon wished Alton could be there with him to fight this foe. She would fight fiercely, and when the battle was won, she would mount him and ride him just as fiercely as she had fought, just as she had after the battle against her own Jalayir tribe. Thinking of her proved to be too much of a distraction, as one of the commanders along the wall whispered to him that the enemy had entered the valley. Bayon strung an arrow and took a calming breath. Women could wait. Right now, he had to find out who was stealing in his name. With a vicious whoop and cry, the enemy surged into the valley and attacked the caravan, but his men high above were ready. They drew their bows and fired, intending to injure but not kill. Thousands of arrows rained down on the valley below, and the enemy cried out in alarm and shouted for retreat. The stiff way they rode their horses appeared unnatural to Bayon, and their own arrows had not been nearly as accurate as a Mongol should have been. These Mongols didn't fight or ride like Mongols. In a single volley from his men, nearly half of the enemy force fell from their saddles. yet they still fought fiercely against Bayon's men. With Birkaday among those on the ground, Bayon knew Birkaday would swiftly take control of the fight. The trap had sprung. Bayon blew a horn for his men in the hills to ride down to join their brothers. In moments, 5,000 Mongols leapt into their saddles and surged down the valley walls toward their foe. On the other side of the valley, Ming Tao's own 5,000 warriors closed in. The rear guards on either side held a closer position to the mouth of the valley, from which the enemy force invaded. They closed around the exit like a tide of bowmen crashing down a rocky shore. There was nowhere for the enemy to run. By the time Bayon's mare reached the valley floor, the fighting had turned vicious. Even outnumbered and dismounted against such a superior force, the enemy fought with desperation toward the point of retreat, with little more than swords remaining.
Cha!
Bayon whipped Ondayar with the reins to pick up her pace. She had a long, powerful stride. They crashed through the enemy together, trampling anyone not fast enough to get out of their way. All around them, their adversaries swung their swords at the legs of horses to dismount men, or at the legs of the men in saddles. Already, Birkaday had captured and tied more than enough men for Bayon to question. He called out an order to kill the rest. Now that none needed to remain alive, the fight ended swiftly. They vastly outnumbered their enemy. In minutes, both Bayon's and Ming Tao's men walked among the dead, stripping them of anything worth keeping to toss into the carts. They dragged the dead to the mouth of the valley where they had come from, and left them to rot as a warning.
"A clever ruse,"
Ming Tao said, riding his mount up beside Bayon. Bayon considered whether he should trust this was the end, and whether Ming Tao would betray him. Yet this victory would bear fruit for Ming Tao's people. Striking out against the Khan's heir now would only bring vengeance down on his head. "Not clever," Bayon said. "I'm surprised you didn't do this yourself. It was almost too easy." Bayon dismounted and strode toward Birkaday as Birkaday tossed a bound prisoner alongside the rest against the wheel of a cart. 20 survivors. Bayon could get the information he sought from this many.
"My lord, these are not Mongols,"
Birkaday said as Bayon joined him. Bayon frowned and crouched in front of the prisoners, examining each of them closely. "Who do you serve?" he asked one man. The prisoner scoffed and spit in his face. Birkaday swung his sword and took the prisoner's head. Bayon rose and stared down at each of the bound men. "I am Bolku Jinong. You are stealing from my people in my name. The first man to tell me who you serve will live. The rest will die." 3 of the men began rambling over each other as the rest glared at Bayon in open defiance. It only took a moment to realize these men were not speaking in the Mongol tongue. Bayon couldn't understand a word of it, but he understood enough to identify them. "Ming raiders?" Bayon turned to Ming Tao. "Have you heard of such a thing before? Ming posing as Mongols to raid us?" Ming Tao shook his head.
"As long as we remain peaceful, they leave us alone."
"Peaceful," Bayon sneered. Peace with the Ming was an abomination. There could be no peace. "What are they saying?" Ming Tao fell silent, listening as the 3 men continued rambling, desperate to save their lives. As he waited, Bayon nodded to Birkaday. The prisoners who remained silent were executed with arrows in the neck. The sound of the arrows thumping through their necks was like a hammer against dirt, followed by blood trickling like water over river stones. Bayon averted his gaze and focused on the 3 who remained.
"They are local commanders of Ming forces,"
Ming Tao said slowly.
"They beg your mercy. They vow to serve you if you do not return them to the Emperor to find out what they've done."
"They are afraid the Emperor will find out?" This could only mean they had acted independently, without commands from their superior officers. Sending them back to the Ming would surely be a death sentence, but it was no less than they deserved. Bayon had no use for Ming slaves, who would just as surely turn on him as serve him. "Send them back to their emperor," Bayon commanded.
"But my lord, the emperor will know we are here,"
Ming Tao said, glancing at the three men as they desperately pleaded for their lives, reaching for Bayon's boots. Bayon stepped back out of reach. He turned a fierce gaze on Ming Tao. "Did you hear nothing I said before? We are here to rise against him, not cower in fear. We are Mongols." Birkaday hauled one of the men to his feet and shoved him back in the direction they had come from. More of Bayon's men followed the command, dragging the pleading, protesting Ming soldiers beside them. One man wrenched himself free and rushed toward Bayon, but before he could take 3 steps, one of Bayon's men shot an arrow through his eye. The Ming soldier dropped dead on the spot. "See that the supplies are returned to their owners," Bayon commanded as he mounted his chestnut mare. "Birkaday, put a man you trust in charge of this."
"My lord."
Birkaday bowed. Bayon rode away from the valley and backed toward the camp with a handful of his guards. Now that the fight was over and the truth revealed, he could see to finding a woman to warm his bed. Everything ached. Bayon tried his best to show no signs of weakness in front of his men, but he hadn't been raised in battle like these men. Balunai, the Korchin tribal Khan, had attempted to harden Bayon with his fists, but it did not seem to have the desired effect. Bayon could take a punch, though he preferred not to, but he could not handle battles without his limbs aching all over. Did all men feel this and just smothered it beneath a mask of strength as he attempted to do? At sunset, Bayon stopped beside a river near the camp to wash off. He ordered his guards to keep watch as he stripped out of his armor and clothes and dunked into the cool water. It seeped into his aching flesh like a salve. Bayon struggled to keep from sighing in relief, afraid the guards would see it as weak. The fewer battles he had to engage in, the better. Bayon had insisted on charging in when Asama and Unabulid were with him, mostly because he felt they expected as much from him. As much as he hated sneaking around, it was much simpler and far less dangerous than charging into a fight on a saddle. Once he had washed the blood and dirt away, Bayon stepped out and rinsed blood off his armor, then slipped on the dirty clothes. He could do nothing about them until returning to his gear. He mounted on Dayar and carried on to the torchlight of camp. A figure paced near his gear, and as he rode closer, he could tell it was a female. Had someone been sent to please him? Bayon certainly would not object. As he dismounted and commanded his guards to keep watch, she stepped into the torchlight toward him. Bayon groaned. He feared this day would come. With the Shakar numbers increasing near his camp, it was only a matter of time before she showed her face. Did she hold a grudge against him, killing her father? "Seeker." "So, it is true," she said, as her eyes scanned him over. "You are Mandul Khan's heir." "Let me guess. You have changed your mind now that I'm set to be the next great Khan," he said, tossing his reins to his servant, Enk, to hobble on Dayar's hooves beside Bayon's gear. "No." "Then why are you here?" Seeker inched closer. "You are in danger, Bayon." He snorted and entered his gear. She followed without invitation. "I was in danger the day you first found me in the desert," he said, tossing his armor aside unceremoniously and stripping off the bloodied deal, unashamed of her presence. She had seen it all before anyway. "Since birth, honestly. Nothing has changed." "You have." Bayon strode toward her so fiercely, Seeker stumbled back away from him until her back was pressed against the wall. He hesitated so close to her. Seeker wasn't so plain anymore. He no longer had to squint to find her attractive like he used to. The past 4 years had been kind to her. He had hoped to find a woman for the night. One found him instead. Bayon ran his fingers along her neck, then pulled her deal loose. Seeker quivered at his touch, sending a rush of arousal through his body. Even after all this time, it was easy to fall into old habits around her. He pressed a heated kiss against her neck. Seeker released a shuddering breath. "Bayon, please." "Are you going to beg this time?" he murmured against her flesh. Some part of him knew dimly that Seeker had likely married since his departure. Another part of him, the louder part of him, did not care. "They are coming for you," Seeker said. Though he heard her words, the desire burning in him drowned their meaning out. His lips trailed along her neck as his fingers tangled in her wild hair. "Let them come." "Bayon." The rest of her words trailed off as his fingers slid between her legs. Bayon had learned a few new tricks in the past 4 years. He intended to share them all with her. Her protests for his life faded into moans of pleasure. In a matter of minutes, the old natural rhythm of their animalistic needs replaced all the urgency in her warning. The men and women traveling with Bayon broke down their gares the next morning. Now that the truth about the Ming trickery had been revealed and his name cleared, Bayon intended to complete his mission along the border and share the Ming deception with everyone he could find. It was a bold move to dress as Mongols and raid caravans, especially without the consent of their emperor. Either they never expected him to arrive, or the Ming intended to sow dissent between tribes. Bayon could only hope that one of those 2 men who survived his attack had raced back to tell the emperor that Bayon rode along the border. He wanted to enrage the emperor, then disappear. Without Asama advising him, Bayon could feel his wits slipping. Deciding to break camp and move had taken him the better part of the morning, as he had debated whether he should make a stand or move on. Seeker had warned him again that he was in danger, but he found women often saw danger lurking in every shadow, and he waved off her concerns as he set to work taking down his gear. As she helped him, he noticed more than once how she continually glanced furtively in every direction, as if she feared his own men would collapse around him and attack. Birkaday would never allow it. He would kill even the slightest whisperer of disloyal aspirations. "Quit jumping at shadows," Bayon grumbled as he passed her with a bundle of lathes to load into the cart. Seeker edged close to him and lowered her voice. "Bayon, not everyone here is happy to have the great Khan meddling in their affairs. Some of these men are content with how things were under the Ming." Bayon heaved in the bundle and snorted. "Then I will teach them how wrong they are." Seeker grabbed his arm as he turned away, jerking him around to face her. "You have become more arrogant than ever. Listen to me. I didn't come all this way to be ignored." Bayon smirked. "Did you feel ignored last night?" "That is not what I'm talking about, and you know it." Bayon's shoulders sagged. Seeker never had a sense of humor. "I appreciate your concern. It's sweet. But I have everything under control. My men are monitoring the Ming. Birkaday is monitoring the men. I am monitoring Birkaday. Mondul is monitoring me. Everyone has someone to report to and someone to watch over. Let the man handle the warfare. You can handle this." Bayon handed Seeker an empty IROG churning bucket. Her lips compressed so tightly the edges turned white before she threw it in the cart and stormed off. As the final materials were loaded into the cart and strapped down, Bayon mounted on Dayar and took in Ming Tao's camp in the distance. It had grown in size as more Shakar tribe members had joined them. Seeker's family must have been among the Shakar. Seeker appeared beside him, placing a hand on his leg as she gazed up at him. Had she married since he left her? It would not be the first married woman he had taken. Could any man really love her? You should go back to your husband, Bayon said from atop his saddle, poking for the truth. He must be wondering where you disappeared to all night. Seeker frowned. He died last summer. Bayon had no response. Did she expect him to take her with him this time? His interests hadn't changed. While she was mildly more attractive than she had been 4 years ago, Bayon valued his freedom for as long as he could wrangle it. One day Mondul would die, and he would be married to Yeke and Mandukhai. Bayon had no interest in rushing toward that fate. Go north, Bayon, Seeker insisted. Return home where you will be safe. I am not safe anywhere. Bayon recalled the discontent he often saw in Unabulad's sharp gaze, and was certain that the moment Unabulad had a chance to kill him, he would seize it. A horn blew to the south, then repeated all along the western watches. Bayon stiffened in the saddle and checked his bow to be sure he had it handy. Bayon, go home, Seeker. He kicked Ondayar into action, riding toward Birkaday as she called after him. What is it? He asked Birkaday. Horns blew along the eastern watches now as well, making Bayon's chest heave in fear. Go north, Bayon. Seeker's warning rang in his head, as he quickly realized north was the only direction they could go if they were to flee. I told Ming Tao not to run, so I cannot either, or he will see me as weak. Bayon cast a longing gaze northward. He wanted to go home. Birkaday stood in his stirrups and stared westward across the rolling plateau dotted with sparse maidenhair trees. Ming soldiers! Bayon's heart fell into his stomach. Already? He had kicked the hornet's nest, and now the swarm was upon him. Some part of Bayon had hoped to be long gone before the Emperor attacked. How did the scouts miss such a force? Should we leave the Shakar to fight the Ming off as we ride north? Birkaday asked. No. Bayon's response was too quick. He took a careful breath. No. I told them to fight, so we fight. Send word for the carts to move north. We will catch up to them once this is over. Birkaday bowed in his saddle and kicked his mare into action. Bayon did not know what else to do now but charge into battle. He sounded the horn to send word to his commanders, and the dulcet tone echoed through his ranks. In minutes, the full force of his 5 Mingans, each 1,000 men strong, rode west. Hopefully, Ming Tao had enough men himself to defend south and east. As his Mingans moved at a slow trot toward the advancing Ming lines, Bayon assessed the enemy. Their forces would be equally met on the battlefield, which meant he had to pick off the edges with arrows before the Ming drew too close. At least 1,000 cavalry flanked the wings of the Ming army, as well as the rear guard, bows and swords in hand. As Bayon increased the speed of his mount to a slow canter, the lines of his 5 Mingan units matched his speed without command. Ming archers covered the wings between cavalry and pikemen. Ming pikemen along the front lines lowered their pikes to pick off the Mongol mounts and break the lines. Bayon spotted their commander at the center of the mass easily enough. That would be their target. Ming archers released a volley of arrows too soon. Most of the arrows fell pathetically to the soil, skipping across rocks and dirt. Bayon watched as a few arrows bounced uselessly off Mongol shields or armor. At this point, Bayon knew he could not have held back his men if he wanted to. Their bloodlust had risen, and they lifted their bows as one while the lines of his Mingans broke into a gallop alongside him. The long line curved inward at the edges to trap the Ming forces. Nerves knotted in Bayan's stomach, but he did his best to push aside the apprehension and focus on his aim. Years of hard training had prepared him for such an encounter, and he raised his bow high, taking aim. As he released, his line followed his lead. Thousands of arrows shot fast and powerful into the front lines of pikemen, throwing soldiers off their feet. He watched as the Ming line collapsed, only to be replaced by a fresh line. Bayan wished he had his own lancers to crash through the front lines and scatter the Ming formations, but the lancers had returned to Monkey Bulag with Unabulid. Ming archers shot another volley of arrows, but their bows were not as powerful as the Mongol bows or armor. Most of the arrows glanced off helmets or chest plates with little damage. Only a few of Bayan's men went down, with a well-placed arrow to the neck. Even as the arrows struck, the Mingans released another volley of their own. For a moment, enemy arrows passed in the air, creating a hum of strings and shafts. Bayan ducked behind his shield as one arrow flew toward his head. This time, more of the Ming pikemen, archers, and footmen fell than before. The Ming commander barked an order, and the cavalry on the outer flank spread outward and charged into the Mongol force. In moments the enemy roiled in chaos, but their commanders held the lines with force, striking any who broke ranks. Mongol and Ming forces crashed together like two massive waves. Horses trampled the footmen unfortunate enough to stand in their way. Ming archers fired with enough force to knock Mongol warriors off balance, ripping Bayan's men from their saddles. Bayan swiftly replaced his bow with his sword. In close quarters, bows were as likely to kill his own men as they were the enemy. He hacked and slashed desperately at any man careless enough to come near. When his sword wouldn't do the trick, he kicked Ondayar back, so she stamped the enemy down. Mongol riders on the wings closed around the Ming force like a vice, and Bayan was certain they would defeat the enemy. A knot of the Ming commander's guards raced toward Bayan, and he called his own men around him. But in the heat of the battle, his men were too far to reach him in time. Somehow, Bayan found himself surrounded by a sea of Ming soldiers. Desperate, Bayan circled back, only to find himself trapped in a wall of Ming troops corralling him toward the Ming commander's guard. Shouts rang out over the clash of swords, squeal of men and horses, and thunder of hooves. Bayan could barely discern Berkaday's voice. He didn't dare take his eyes off the command guard as it fought its way toward him in a tight knot. A horn sounded. A surge of panic rose in Bayan's chest. Something had gone horribly wrong. All across the battlefield, the Mongol lines collapsed. His Mingans had more men on foot than on horseback. Bayan continued swinging his sword like a cudgel through the mass of Ming troops. But he was outnumbered, and the command guard lumbered ever closer. Bayan dared a glance to locate where the horn had sounded, only to discover a full tumen of 10,000 Shakar riders galloping away. Everything seemed too slow for a moment as Bayan took in the horror of their impending defeat. More Ming troops closed in on the southern flank of his men.
"Not everyone here is happy to have the great Khan meddling in their affairs," Seeker had said.
Had someone betrayed him?
"Some of these men are content with how things were under the Ming."
Had Ming Tao betrayed him to keep the great Khan out of the south? It would never work. If Bayan died, he knew Mandul would send everything he had against the south. Sweat coated Bayan's forehead, making his helmet slip. "But I don't want to die."
"Bulku!"
Berkaday's warning shout came too late. An arrow thumped against Bayan's chest hard enough to knock him off the saddle and lodge in his armor. His back hammered against the unforgiving earth, knocking the air from his lungs.
"To the prince!"
Berkaday's voice roared over the thunder of battle. Bayan gasped for air, relieved that the armor had stopped the arrow.
Before he could climb to his feet, a Ming soldier swung his sword down at Baon's neck. He rolled aside as another blow landed on the back of his armor. He tried to stand, but something slammed into his back and sent him sprawling on the ground. Dirt coated his mouth and covered his face. Ondayar reared her front legs in the air and came down on another Ming soldier. Baon watched as the man's skull crushed under the force of the mare's hooves. Blood sprayed in his face. A Ming horse charged toward him. Baon rolled aside to his feet, attempting to scramble out of the way. Before the rider reached him, a thunderous thump of arrows rained down on the command guard, bearing down on him. Baon instinctively ducked, shielding his head with his arms. When he looked up a moment later, Birkaday appeared at his side on horseback, holding the reins of Baon's mare. Without a second of hesitation, Baon scrambled onto Ondayar's back.
"Retreat with the prince!"
Birkaday hollered, then signaled for arrows. As the Mongol riders fired, the Ming commander shouted an order deep in the knot of his own guards. His sword pointed directly and unmistakably at Baon.
"Go!"
Birkaday commanded.
"They are here for you. We will guard your retreat."
Retreat. Baon loathed the idea of retreating, of allowing the Emperor to think he had won. Yet in all his life, Baon had only one instinct: to survive. He had fled assault before. This would be no different. An arbin of 10 guards around Baon tightened ranks, firing arrows without mercy and swinging swords when their foe came too close. As they rode away from the Ming commander and his guards, the Shikar raced over the ridge to the south into the fray, replenishing his forces and giving Baon a chance to escape. Baon blinked blood from his eyes, unsure if it was his or someone else's. As his arbin helped him escape the fray, Baon wondered if maybe he had made a serious mistake coming here. How could he ever hope to take on the Ming when he couldn't win this minor battle? Baon now longed for the safety and comfort of Monkey Bulag. After all, Unabulid was only one man, and Mandukhai only a woman. He would rather take his chances with the enemy he knew. Baon's guards rode north with him until he crested a hilltop overlooking the raging battle below. The Ming had attacked the camp on all 3 sides, south, east, and west. Ming to the east had raced away, disappearing in the distance with Mongols giving chase. They had concentrated the largest portion of their forces in the south, where the Shikar fought like devils to rout them. The Ming to the south had shifted course and raced west to join with the army there. This had brought the Shikar to the aid of Baon's men on Ming heels. The Ming had nearly routed the full 2 tumens of 10,000 Mongol warriors each by dividing the Mongol forces all across the battlefield, over 20,000 Mongols in total. Yet, as the Shikar pressed the Ming forward, Baon's Mingans pulled back to form a ring on the northern edge of the battlefield on Birkaday's command. And then the carnage began. Under the relentless pressure of the Mongol ring of warriors striking against the edges of their lines, the Ming defense finally collapsed and broke away. They retreated south, with several thousand Shikar on their heels. Baon watched as the Ming likely sought refuge in whatever pass they had come from. In their wake, they left thousands of their own dead strewn across the battlefield. As Baon watched, panting and wiping his sleeve against his brow, he couldn't help but wonder who had been scouting that pass. Either the scouts were inept and should be punished, or someone had allowed the Ming to sneak up on them. Some of these men are content with how things were under the Ming.
This insult could not go unpunished. Why had the Shikar turned away on the battlefield before coming in at last?
Baon wiped blood off his sword with his silk belt. He flicked drops onto the ground beside Ondayar. Anger pulsed through him. Seeker had tried to warn him, and he hadn't listened. He would listen now.
If you enjoyed this sample, click the links in the description to hear more. Do you want free audiobooks, ebooks, or autographed paperbacks? Join me on Patreon at patreon.com/szdavies_character-assassin. You'll gain access to my Discord server, behind-the-scenes updates, merch, and so much more.